I want to point out one thing about how wildlifers and foresters tend to sometimes look at things a little bit differently. There's a certain culture used in your presentation there that some wildlife biologists would say, hey, that would make a really nice bat tree as it gets older. So, you know, there are oftentimes differences in perspectives between forest managers, timber managers, and wildlife managers. So that's part of the interesting discussion that we hope will continue tomorrow. We've had just a touch of it today. This has been great. We'll start back tomorrow, and I'm going to ask, after I say something, if Dr. Leopold or Ezel need to say anything else. We'll start back, coffee's on at 8 o'clock. First presentation will be at 8:20. And anything? No, but if you're anything like me, you've probably thought of some questions you didn't get around to asking today. Write them down, because if you're anything like me, you won't remember them tomorrow. And tomorrow we're going to have an afternoon of questioning and answering time. So go ahead and write them down, please.
See if I can avoid some of the same problems we've had up here with some of the other notice with the mouth. First of all, you know, this is based on work that John and I have done over a lot of years, so it's not just my work by any means at all. What happened back in the 70s, John got to Mississippi State. I was working out in Texas at the time. He got to Mississippi State about 2 years before I started out in Texas. But both of our phones started ringing. And people had problems. They had hardwoods, and we had oaks in the overstory, but we weren't getting any oaks back. Now, one thing we know how to do is we know how to cut trees. We've known how to do that for a long, long time, right? As foresters, we may or may not. It always amazes me how many people think that are not associated with forestry, how many people think that forestry majors are well versed in the use of a chainsaw. Truth, I have to keep telling them, we don't have any courses in Chainsaw 101 or Logging 102 or anything like that. But we know how to cut trees, and we've done that for a long time, whether it's managers, we had loggers, or whatever. But we were not getting oaks back. So we started working on this, folks, back in the 70s. This is a widespread problem all the way across the South. My compliments to the folks at White River, if they haven't had that problem. Most folks have. The principal components appear to be pretty simple. Possibilities for the answers, or the possible answers, are pretty complex. So it's not as simple as it sounds. We've got it down. After all of these years, we've got it down to where we can give you a pretty simple prescription, but it took a long time to get there. A lot of folks sitting in this room right now have been part of finding the answers. They have worked on one aspect or another of that research. So here are the factors. This is not going to come as any surprise to you. We've got to have a seed source if we're going to get any species back. That's a little bit more problem for some species than others. We've got to have a seed crop, not just enough to have a source. We've got to have some fertility. This is not pines by any means at all. We can't just start these things on the north end of the property and go to the south. We've got to have some soil moisture. It's true for any species. We've got to have some light. This is where a lot of people have fallen off the wagon. Really important to remember that commercially important species in the South, almost all of them are shade intolerant species. And a lot of folks, when they've tried to take pine mentality over the hardwoods, we've lost sight of that. They're not going to regenerate and grow well unless we have ample light. In bottomland hardwood areas, it goes back one there. We usually have a seed source unless we have removed it past harvesting practices. In other words, we've started out somewhere in the past, we've had a good seed source. We may have sequentially removed it, we may not have. Hopefully we haven't. Seed crop is variable. That's really important. That's something that we have had to quantify down through the years. We have an ongoing project right now with masting, looking at seed crops. How do they vary by tree? How do they vary by species? We're trying to look across the entire LMAV. It's kind of a daunting process, but we're getting there. We're getting ahead. One thing I can tell you, it's highly variable. Fertility and moisture are typically sufficient Now, we do know that there are some issues with soil moisture. You might not have enough all the time. Most of the time we have enough to get by. We may have too much in some places. That leaves us one element. That's light. If you eliminate all of the others and you get down to it, what's going to be important? It's going to be light. So when we get to mature hardwood, you've already heard some of these items being alluded to earlier. Some of it's just going to be reinforcement. You go to the top of the canopy, you got 100% full light. I can take any light sensor, any light meter that we have, and go to the top of the canopy, I'm going to have 100%. You go to the forest floor, we saw this earlier with some of the work that Brian had done during his graduate work. Typically it's less than 10%, usually less than 5%. I go up there with a light meter, I get up here on the top somewhere, I'm going to get 100%. This is one of my Where's Waldo pictures. Anybody see Waldo? Still awake back there? It's been a long day. There's Waldo. That's actually Jonathan, but he's Waldo in this slide. How much light's into the forest floor? Jonathan's stood there. You can see it. See the sun flex? It's only about 4% full sunlight. That's what we're getting. Not enough, folks. That's very typical. Seedling right requirements, just some generalities here. The minimum for the growth and development of the red oak group, around 25%. Dr. Gardner worked on this. Some others have worked on it also. The maximum that a small seedling can use, that's not a total big red oak, but a small seedling, can only use about 50 to 60% in that range. So, could the seedling survive if they had more light? Maybe, if they didn't have too much competition. What happens is when you get too much light in there, you get highly competitive species. It gets kind of hard for that oak. You heard Wayne talking about the fact that we see oaks, they're not the fast high growth early on. They got to put down a root system. You know, if it takes too long putting down that root system, they'll never get up. So what's the solution then? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Just eliminate or reduce that light interception to where you get in that magic range, at least for the oaks. Get it down to the forest floor without damaging any of the desirable overstory. And try not to damage any of the existing seedlings. Sounds simple enough, does it not? Not always that easy. Some species, literally some species, may require more light. You can do that pretty easily. The more shade intolerant they are, actually, the more opportunities that we have if we have a seed source. If I've got a light seed species such as yellow poplar, Dr. Wayne talked about, we've got yellow poplar all over Kentucky, right? John has often joked about the fact that if all you want is yellow poplar, all you have to do is have a seed tree somewhere within a quarter of a mile and scratch the surface of the Mother Earth. You're going to get a yellow poplar back. Very durable seed, stays in the forest floor for a long time. So some things are easier than others, but a lot of what we want in southern hardwood is very difficult. Cottonwood's not as easy as it sounds. Sycamore has its own challenges, but they'll stand more light. So where's the problem? The problem for most of the South, those undesirable stems in the midstory and understory. That's the third time that you've heard it today. Mr. Denman was showing you that they don't have much of a problem with that at White River. Most of the South does. Here's one item that it took us a while to see. Those stems were not on those sites when many or most of the existing hardwood stands first established. They weren't there. There wasn't that established midstory or understory that the oaks had to fight their way up through. The oaks came up, as Wayne was talking about, they came up with the competition. If we can recognize or establish that natural history of bottomland hardwoods, that's been very important to us in understanding how all of this works, and it's all gone back to some research and going back to stand establishment, to stand development procedures. Just a shot of an area. Look at the average size of the trees in there. Anyone see any huge diameter overstory trees? No. Anybody see very much light getting to the ground? No. So it doesn't have to be a 30, 40, 50, whatever inch overstory tree to intercept all of that light. That layer right there is very, very, and put the slide in there where you can see there is full sunlight out there, then you can see how much is getting to the ground. They're very efficient in intercepting the glow of light. Then we get down to biology and economics. We need a cost-effective solution for everything that we do. I mean, for everybody that's ever been in my silviculture class, you've heard it over and over. There are two parts of silviculture, biology and economics. We have to have something that's cost-effective. The vast majority of the people who own hardwood bottoms or manage bottomland hardwood areas do not have a never-ending checkbook. They can't just go out and spend money. If cost is not a consideration, I can grow virtually any species. I can grow coconut palms on Mississippi State's campus if I have absolutely no bottom to my checking account. I can do that. I do all right in the summertime. I do pretty well. The heating bill is going to be kind of rough through the winter, but I can grow a coconut palm. That's not a problem. The whole point of it is we have to do something that's cost effective. We've got to have economics involved in it. So here are our control options. We go out there with a chainsaw, and we have done chainsaw site prep. If you've been around long enough, some of you may remember that in the hardwood bottom. We can do mowing, we can do a bulldozer, we can do foliar spray with herbicides, we can do basal bark, or we can do injection. Those first three are just like drugs. Just say no. Just don't do it. And not a good option to do down in bottom. I mean, you're going to do more damage than you're going to do good. It's just not a good item at all. Besides, you may leave a bulldozer down there for quite a while if you get in there where it's a little too wet. It might become a permanent fixture. Foliar spray with herbicides, we have three problems. You may not be able to get to the foliage of everything that you're trying to spray. You certainly may not be able to spray without getting onto some of your desirable stems. Second problem, if you go to something that has some soil activity, that could be problematic. You get it on the ground, you may hurt something that you don't want to hurt. And then the last one, we just have a lot of species we're trying to control. They're not the most susceptible to foliar active only. So foliar spray with herbicides, not a good idea. Actually provides us with some options. If you got a privet problem, come talk to me later. We can do that. You know, when you get into a multi-story canopy like this, you got them all the way down. You're trying to take out things in here and in here. It gets to be a problem. Basal bark is an option. Here comes cost effectiveness again. Will it work? Well, it works marginally effective on some species, almost ineffective on a lot of stems that are over 4 inches in diameter, and it's expensive, folks. Very, very expensive. Injection, if we're trying to get rid of those stems in that mid-story, understory, injection is our best option. That's our most cost-effective option for getting rid of those stems that are an inch in diameter or greater. Hitting the target vegetation and not hitting the non-target vegetation. You saw that slide earlier. That's from some work that we did. This goes all the way back in the 90s, where we had some gaps in the canopy, and all we did was mid-story injection. You can see how much light. That's the edge of the injected plot. It all look like this in terms of mid-story stems. You can see how much light's getting to the ground back here, how much getting to the ground up there. It'd be nice if it was all that simple. So what do we get from oak seedlings if we don't have any additional treatments, or if we do have some additional treatments? Well, if we don't have any additional treatments, you have to have some gaps in the overstory, either from natural disturbances or past harvests, but you've got to have something to let it break through the overstory. It's often not a problem, sometimes it is. Just to show you, this is a 5th year evaluation. We've taken these plots even further, where we treated, and that indicates that we took out the mid-story, understory by injection. Our survival of oak seedlings ran from 64 to 87%. This is over about 3 different studies. Height increased from about 3 to 4.5 times. I mean, they were growing, they were coming out. In the untreated, survival was 0 to 4%. Height increased 6 to 11%. It's less than 1% that are still alive. If you don't get some light to them, they're not going to make it. Well, an oak seedling, most of the oak seedlings are going to die in the first year. We know that. You can go out there and have a carpet of oak seedlings. You can go back, like John told you, you can go back out there the second year, most of them would be gone if they don't have enough light that they can put some photosynthate down. Will all of them die? No. Do we have literature that show that they can live 5 to 10 years? Yes. Do they respond well to release? No. I mean, they can hang on. If they can just get a little bit of light here and there, they can hang on. But you need to release them quickly. So some stands may need additional treatment. If you've got a fully stocked overstory, you're going to have to do something. This is just a case where we had one, wasn't much light getting to the ground, as you can see. Very fully stocked overstory. We took out the mid-story and understory. You can see the dead skeletons in the mid-story all the way through. We still didn't have enough light. We took available light from 4 to 5% average. We took it all the way up to 15 to 16%. That's still not enough light, folks. Not for any of our shade intolerant species. So we had to take out part of the overstory. So we tried 3 different levels. Kind of a light, if you want to call it a light touch, a medium touch, and a heavy touch, just to see what's going to work well. We cut it back to 70, a residual of 70 square feet. And we've done this in 3 different studies now. There's 50 square feet. There's 30 square feet, right after we did the cutting. Now to get back to some light here, how much do we have? Well, in 30 square feet, this is an average of, like I said, multiple studies, range from 58 to 78%. Just depending on where the plot fell and where the residual trees were. What is that number? That's all more light than that oak seedling can use. What we're doing is we're favoring some of the more shade intolerant competition coming in on it. This is kind of like a Goldilocks, you know, too hard, too soft, just right, too much light, too little light, just the right amount of light. There it is. There's your Goldilocks right there. Our residual basal area of 50 square feet, we are right in the upper end of that zone that red oak seedling wants. White oak seedling will like it fine. 70, we really don't have enough light. Single tree selection, this is without any injection now. Single tree selection, average 7 to 22, and that's getting out in the middle of the opening, folks. That's not hiding along the edge somewhere. If I hide along the edge, it's going to say 0 to 1, 0 to 2. Small groups, 11 to 37%. Now this is getting up to where an oak seedling can make it. Our problem with the small groups is that they close in pretty quickly. You know, we heard it earlier. What happened to those trees? Well, when that canopy closes back in, we're going to run out of light. All right, other considerations. I've got to hurry. Oh, we put something in on deer habitat and some aesthetics. A lot of folks are very worried about that. A lot of private landowners want it to look just right. Talk about a Goldilocks. That's the ultimate Goldilocks. I want all my forests, and I want to eat it too. I want the habitat. I want the commercially important species, but I want it to be pretty at the same time. I don't want it to look like anybody's been in there doing anything. Good luck. But anyway, Steve and I are actually working on this project where we looked at the amount of deer habitat or deer browse that might be produced. I don't see any reason why we can't produce good wildlife habitat and have good hardwood management at the same time. We look at the residual basal area, once again 30, 50, and 70, and we look at the deer days. This is based on crude protein, is it not? Remember how Wayne deferred to Randy on the genetics? Here's the man that knows about the crude protein levels right here. This was at 9% level. These were the number of deer days that we had. Obviously, we're not getting very much at 70. That's not very much light. Looks good at 50, even better at 30. Biomass, the more light you have, typically the more biomass you're going to get. Just a quick note down here. The 50 square feet gave us the most deer days at that 14% lactating doe. That's what?
Supports the lactating.
Support for lactating doe. See, I haven't forgot everything that Steve has told me down through the years. All right, 50 square feet gave us the most at that level. Second the most, the 9% level, not that far behind the biomass. Seems to be optimizing our deer habitat production and certainly optimizing our our oak regeneration. As far as aesthetics are concerned, this was taken when it was pretty shady, but you see how open it still is. It can be seen. That's in the middle of the summer. I brought a worst case scenario slide. If someone's going to worry about they can't see, in the middle of the winter, this is all melted down. This is herbaceous out there. Now, are the oak seedlings in there? The oak seedlings are in there. Are they coming up through it? They're coming up through it. I don't know if that's gonna make a landowner happy or not, folks, but the aesthetics as far as this is concerned, I mean, we still got trees out there, relatively open, it's not a huge brush pile. So our optimal level of partial reduction, we think is 50, cut it back to 50 square feet residual overstory, basal area. Just some summary real quickly. It appears to us that controlling the mid-story, understory is essential in most of the bottomland hardwood areas. Now, it might be all where you are, but certainly across the stem, certainly across the south, we're going to have to do that. You may have to do partial overstory removal, just depends on the history of where you're managing. Conducting regeneration activities in conjunction with a seed crop is very important. You can do all of this work, get the plate set, so to speak, and if you don't have a seed crop, you're not going to get regeneration. It's pretty simple. The other way of looking at that is if you can move someone in quickly to do all of the others. You can see you've got a seed crop down, or you had good regeneration. If you can go in and get everything, get it released, you can go from that side. All right, light availability seems to be the key. We have no problems whatsoever saying that light availability is the key to successful natural regeneration of the oaks and a lot of these other commercially desirable species. Single tree selection, the other small openings do not provide sufficient light. Most of the area that we have worked with, I mean, Anderson Tully, you heard John say this morning, Anderson Tully did it for 100 years. They don't do it anymore. There's a reason they don't. I think anything can work. I like what Jeff Denman said. Nothing works everywhere. Everything might work somewhere. We're talking about the vast majority of the area here. I've looked at thousands of acres, folks, that were managed with single tree selection, if that's what you want to call it. They were harvested with single tree selection. We don't have the desirable species out there anymore. Too much light may favor the highly competitive species. We don't necessarily want to go to that. After you do this, if you cut it back to 50, after you get the regeneration established, you can either leave those trees if you want to see a 2H stem and have a little bit different look on the aesthetics, or you can take them off, whatever you want to do. But John said it this morning. I didn't know he was going to say it, but I guess it's not totally unusual. We might have sort of the same message. It takes more than just cutting to get these species back. If all we had to do was go out there and cut trees down, we wouldn't have ever been losing oaks, would we? Or some of these other species. We still have just as many as we ever started out with. Well, that's not the way it is. It takes more than cutting. So all you're going to do is harvest trees. All you're going to do is go out there and cut. You either need to be really lucky, or be prepared to lose your desirable species, or get your checkbook and a dibble bar out. It'll be one of those three. I don't know if I have time for questions or not, but I appreciate your time.
Just one if there's somebody that's really jumping to ask something.
But I will be here tomorrow. Yes.
After seeing all of that and knowing the DFCs and the parameters that Kenny presented this morning, the 50 BAs you recommend seems to fall right in line with those recommendations. Did I miss something in there, or is that consistent?
Well, the 50 square feet is what we would cut back to if we didn't have gaps in the canopy. But it still requires control of the mid-story and the understory. In other words, if all we do is cut it back to 50 square feet of basal area and don't control the mid-story, understory, if we don't get the light down there, we're not going to get that desirable regeneration back. So that may be what's inconsistent. That might be the missing factor.
Or, I think it is very consistent, like that Jeff presented. I mean, from the DFC side, I mean, even those little small mid-story trees, they get pinned on, they go to the ground. So we take all the mid-story, or the bulk of the mid-story out as well. So we're taking that out and bringing the BA down to say 50. So that's why I'm a little confused on.
Well, cutting the mid-story or understory down doesn't get rid of it. I mean, if we're talking about hardwood, they're going to resprout. They're coming right back. Not the same. Thank you.
All the talks today, what we're going to talk about in this talk is probably going to contradict a lot of what we've heard. So we'll discuss it afterwards. Let's see if I get this down here. Okay, with that title about uneven age silviculture not working, and myself and the co-authors on this presentation, we've spent several meetings discussing this presentation, and fine tuning it, we came up with the question, will southern bottomland red oaks develop into overstory canopy trees and openings created by single tree selection and group selection systems? And we've got a variety of sources we're going to go through. But first, let's have a little introduction on the LMAV oak resource. This is a slide based on based on some work that Neil Gardner is doing right now with the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station's Southern Forest Futures Project. And he's got some really interesting results that are going to be coming out soon. One is looking at LMAV oak, or acreage of forests in the LMAV. In the 1930s, we had approximately 13.7 million acres. And of that forest land, it was split about half and half with oak and non-oak types. But by 2010, we can see that we are down to 6.8 million acres, and actually that is an increase. All this afforestation that has been going on has actually increased the numbers of acreage from what it used to be. But we're still about half of what we were in the 1930s. What has changed also is the proportion of that forest land that is in oak forest types. An obvious explanation for that is that most of a higher percentage of our oak forest ground was cleared for agriculture. But another possible reason may have to do with this recent publication in Forest Ecology and Management that looked at FIA data over a 28-year period, looking at the change in relative oak density. Again, relative oak density. They also looked at things like basal area and volume as well. But we went with the density slide. And again, this is over a 28-year period. If you kind of look at a line here between Arkansas and Louisiana and extend it over to Mississippi, you can see that over this 28-year period, we've had an increase in the relative oak density in forests in the LMAV, and that in large part is due to the Atchafalaya Basin. And the theory there is that it's filling up with sediment and it's becoming more and more of an oak site. For reasons that we can't really explain, if you look north of that line, you can see based on the colors that we are having a decrease in relative oak density. That doesn't necessarily mean we're losing oak forests, it's just the density of oaks in that forest is declining, and we're not sure why. Now, that should make for some interesting discussion points right there. Now let's go into the first source. We've heard a lot of comments today about John Putnam and his publication from 1960, Putnam, Furnival, and McKnight. This was a landmark publication at that time. And again, let's keep in mind the date here, 1960. In essence, what that was an expert system. John Putnam developed the tree class system, presented in some earlier publications, but this is the one that's often cited. And this system is still in use today. The premise of this publication is uneven age silviculture for mixed species stands, including oaks. He recognized the even agedness of some of our early pioneer shade intolerant species like willow and cottonwood. Why was it uneven age silviculture with Mr. Putnam? And I've read his earlier writings that were very interesting historically that led up to this. One was the paradigm at the time across the United States was practicing uneven age silviculture from the west coast to the east coast, and especially in Douglas fir stands, which turned out to be a miserable failure. But it was the paradigm at the time in the 30s, 40s, and 50s to practice uneven age silviculture. Also, when this lab was started here in the 1940s, a person by the name of Mr. Russ Reynolds was on the advisory board here at the lab. Mr. Reynolds was the leader of the Crosset Experimental Forest. And by this time, he had about 15 to 20 years of uneven age silviculture in pine, mixed loblolly shortleaf. And Mr. Putnam has noted in some of his articles how the results of that work appealed to him. And again, also at that time, that was the best available knowledge we had that led into that publication. But one of the things in reading Mr. Putnam's work is he always assumed reproduction. I don't think, based on what we're seeing, he ever took a regeneration clock. He's always assuming that desirable regeneration would come. And also, based on some of the stuff that Wayne talked about, stand dynamics were not really recognized yet at the time, that oaks, red oaks in particular, can surpass some other species over time. In essence, what this publication did was a one-size-fits-all, which we've already heard today. It does not necessarily, it really shouldn't be the case. You got to look at each stand individually. The next source we're going to go into is 2A. This is Emil and John's publication in 1988, Growth and Biomass Distribution of Cherry Bark Oak Seedlings as Influenced by Light Availability. And this is the format I'm going to use for these sources, a little introduction. It was a shade house study, looking at light availability of 100% to 53%, 27%, and 8%. Basically, and some important points in this study that I think have gotten lost over time, is that this study involved complete competition control, so above and below ground competition were controlled, and soil moisture was maintained to field capacity throughout the growing season. And they presented in their publication, this study was replicated twice, 2-year results both times. This is not their shade house. I had to throw a pondberry slide in here, of course. But this is reflective of a shade house type study where you control everything but the light availability. And you can see from their results, and this gets cited often, that seedlings that are getting intermediate levels of sunlight, here 53 and 27%, had the tallest heights after 2 years. But keep in mind now, this is not natural conditions. This was an experiment to look specifically at the influence of light. So keep that in mind as we go into this second study, 2B, Benjamin Ware and Emil, Partial Cutting and Establishment of Artificial Nut All Oak Regeneration in the Mississippi Alluvial Plain. And this study was implemented in Sharkey County. This study looked at harvesting to residual stocking levels of 0% or a clear cut, 25% and 50%, and they presented 3rd-year results. In this case, below ground competition is in effect, and as well as above ground. And this is an example of, I believe, one of the intermediate basal area, or one of the intermediate stocking guides, or stocking treatments. And the results show that in natural conditions, not the artificial conditions created by shade house studies, you can see that nut all oak seedling relative height growth, or the height growth compared to its initial height, is much, much higher in the open sunlight condition. Where we have partial shade, especially this 25% of shade, 50% of shade, which may or less be equivalent to the shade house studies, in this case, nut all oak seedlings did not perform as well as in the open. Because here, these seedlings are not only in partial shade, but they have below ground competition in effect too from the overstory trees, in addition to things that are coming up with them. So bear in mind this partial shade business, I'll get into the conclusions here. Quantity of sunlight reaching red oak seedlings is important for growth. But best red oak seedling growth occurred in full sunlight when growing in natural conditions. So seedlings are having to compete both above and below ground across all residual stockings. Greater red oak height in partial shade in the shade house experiment reflects the importance of above ground and below ground competition on oak seedling height growth, because these were controlled in the shade house experiments. All right, I'm going to jump to a third study now. This is Bob Johnson and Roger Crenard, published in 1989. Survival and growth of nut all oak seedlings following selection cutting, 28-year remeasurements. And as an old academic person, one of the big advantages of Forest Service research is long-term studies. They can keep up with things over time. It's something that we can't really do often in academia. This was implemented in 1958, 1 year following a bumper acorn masting. How bumper was it? Well, in the year they put in the study, they had 138,000 nut all oak seedlings per acre based on their sampling. This is that carpet of oak seedlings that you've seen in a couple of slides. 138,000. Keep that number in mind. They implemented single tree and group selection cuts 1, 2, 3, or 4 years after plots were established. And opening sizes ranged from, in the single tree, 2 1/100ths of an acre to more or less 8/10ths of an acre in size. And they did a release treatment at age 9 where we're still trying to backtrack some of the records to see whether this was a release among the competing species within the gap or removing some of the trees around the gap. And this is an example of slides that, here's a single tree selection. Basically, you have a tree that was taken out and it's starting to grow back in growth. And here was a group selection In the lab, we go with what we consider to be the textbook definition of a group selection opening size, and that's 2 times the canopy height, the diameter of the opening. So for a 100-foot tall canopy, that would be almost 3/4 of an acre. Well, here's your 28 results. 138,000 not all oak seedlings per acre. After 28 years, this faint green line is ash. This purple line is Buddy's hackberry. And this red line is red oaks, the not all oaks. You can see, and here's the diameter class going from 2 to 10 inches and stems per acre. You can see by age 28, the ash and the sugarberry were more or less dominating the stand. What happened to that 138,000 not all oak seedlings per acre? They got overtopped. And so some of the conclusions from Johnson and Kennard is that not all oak is unlikely to develop satisfactorily following selection cutting. Red oak sapling surviving the regeneration phase of stand development did not advance into the overstory 28 years after selection cutting. Faster growing competitors overtop not all oak across all opening sizes. Oak prominence in the former overstory is decreasing and the stands converting to a green ash sugarberry stand. Not all oak, again, going back to not all oak is unlikely to develop in these openings. Openings 200 feet in width, or about 3/4 of an acre, do not provide sufficient sunlight to sustain red oak dominance in the stand, and this was a red oak stand at the time. To sustain red oak, they speculated the minimum openings of 300 feet in width, or about 1.5 acres. And again, something we like to point out, and I've got my scientist hat on here right now, that size was not tested. So please don't run off with that size and start using that because Stoneville said so. It has not been tested. Openings larger than 2 times the canopy height in our book, or more than 2 times the canopy height, are considered clear cuts. We're using the textbook on group selection. The 4th study, and this one is out in the hallway here. And so please take a look at the poster out there. It provides a lot of information. Opening size, light availability, and red oak development. The goal here is to identify the proportion of various opening sizes likely to receive a level of direct sunlight sufficient for supporting red oak development into the overstory. So we have these nice colors to look at. In essence, what we're looking at is the illumination here from either 0 hours in the purple to the very light color 10 hours per day based on specific latitude and longitude. I think this was the lab's area right here. So in essence, if we look at a 1/4 acre opening size, and we're using the circular size here, you can see that there's simply not enough light reaching the forest floor here. As we go up through these various sizes, 1 acre, 2 acres, we're just starting to pick up in the center, just maybe a little bit of enough sunlight for a red oak seedling. But when we get in these larger sizes, like 4 acres and 8 acres, we can see that we're getting a predominantly sufficient sunlight for red oak regeneration. So the conclusions, and again, this is in preparation, the poster is in the hallway. Canopy opening width smaller than 4.5 times the canopy height are likely to suppress red oak development in favor of shade-tolerant species across more than 50% of the opening. So 100-foot tall canopy, that'd be about 3.7 or 4 acres, more or less. Bottom line, red oak sustainability appears achievable only in even-age silvicultural systems. And finally, Oliver, the last study we're going to review, the increasing scarcity of red oak in Mississippi River floodplain forests, influence of the residual overstory, and this study was supported by the lab. He looked at, his objective was to determine the influence of different levels of residual basal area on height growth of young red oaks and other species. And the hypothesis was that composition from residual trees may slow the height growth of sapling red oaks and prevent them from growing into the overstory. And you've seen this graph before, and one thing I wanted to add on to this is that this is based on maximum annual height growth, not mean annual height growth. And we've emailed back and forth with Chad to ask why he used maximum height growth instead of means, and it had to involve the differences in shade tolerances, things like that. But the point here is that if we look at the residual basal areas here, and Brett Fry was good enough to put it in English units, you can see that it doesn't take very much residual basal area to start slowing down red oaks much more so relative to some of the other species that we have in these stands. And this may be an explanation of why in some of these small openings or residual basal areas in general, we're not getting our red oaks to come, they're established, but they're not going to be able to grow to the overstory. So he concluded saplings of all species grow best with no shade. With increasing overtopping competition, high growth of red oaks progressively declined. Other species also declined, but red oak height growth declined more than the other species. Thus, red oaks lose the ability to outcompete the overstory, to compete for overstory canopy position as residual basal area increases. And this was a quote from his paper. This study indicates that no red oaks will grow well in partial shade. Consequently, essentially complete removal of residual taller trees appears necessary to maintain red oaks as a significant component of the new forest. So if we go back to our question that we started out with, will southern bottomland red oaks develop into overstory canopy trees in openings created by single tree selection and group selection? Well, based on these research results, we say no. Also, application of selection silviculture to bottomland red oak stands will result in less red oaks in the next stand. Selection systems simply do not provide enough light for bottomland red oaks to successfully compete. And the presence of a bumper oak seed cohort, 138,000 seedlings per acre, does not guarantee oak development into an overstory canopy position. And lastly, consequences of practicing uneven age silviculture in bottomland red oaks. Potential loss of tree species richness, especially shade intolerant species. Reduced vertical structure based on tree heights. Not all oak gets up to about 120 feet tall in general. Sugarberry, 80 to 100 feet tall, so you may have, as a stand may convert from not all oak to sugarberry, you may have a 17 to 33% reduction in the height of that stand. Loss of potential emergent species. Some of the shade intolerance, they get very tall, that are important for some of our neotropical migrants. One that we debated quite a bit was potential loss of mid-story canopy. And the example I come up with there is, areas that had been using the Putnam system repeatedly for decades, basically it resulted in shade-tolerant sugarberry stands. And it's difficult for sugarberry to grow underneath sugarberry. It's a dense sugarberry stand because there's so much light being absorbed by the sugarberry. We've been in some stands in some of our hardwood group meetings and had discussion where we've been in sugarberry stands and they are fairly open underneath. So as we convert, and again, that's the old Putnam system, and the way the stands were managed over time, that we may lose that mid-story. And also with all this, we reduce our future management options. And I'll leave with that, Paul and his cerulean warbler.
One question?
Yeah.
So where does that leave us? 4 to 5 acre even age studs? Is that kind of where we're at?
Based on these results, if you want to maintain red oak in a red oak stand, that appears to be the minimum size you have to have, assuming you already have some red oak seedlings to advance reproduction.
I'd like to make one thing clear that you kind of breezed over. It's not about regeneration. It's about developing that oak into a canopy position. We can have regeneration under just about any kind of canopy condition that we have. But to develop it up into a competitive canopy position, that's a much different story. And that's what this...
Because that's what Anderson Tully found a long time ago, that they could get the regeneration in, but if they didn't release it, and get more sunlight, it wasn't going to survive very long. So you get a lot of regeneration, but you have to release it.
You want to ask a question?
And Brown, I think that's an important point, because I kind of got lost in your presentation there a little bit, because you kept going from regeneration to the canopy, and that's the part of the discussion, regeneration to get it up to some height, and then releasing that regeneration to push it to the canopy. And so it's two fundamentally different questions that's on the table.
Well, one thing we wanted to do in our discussions and putting this together was to bring in the shade house study.
because that gets used often, it has been used today, is as the oak seedlings start out and grow best in partial shade, and that's not what we're finding, because that's a shade house study, and there's factors controlled there that are not controlled in the woods.
I am not your academic type, so I have to have notes. Otherwise, I get lost in what I'm saying. Are y'all tired of talking about regeneration? Let's talk about trees, logs, that kind of thing. So I'm gonna put my glasses on.
Trees come from seedlings.
Well, I know, but we had 138,000 of them, so now we're gonna talk about 40 or 50. So what I wanna do is I wanna present recommendations for what I'm calling a silvicultural strategy, calling it stand quality management, that we can use to manage existing stands of southern bottomland hardwoods, and I'll run through an example of how we might implement that. So stand quality management, as I said, is a silvicultural strategy that we develop to plan and execute intermediate cuttings in bottomland hardwoods. When we designed this several years ago, it was designed for even age systems, where the primary objective of the landowner was the production of high quality hardwood saw timber. And the goal of stand quality management is to develop and maintain a high level of stand quality, with stand density being relegated to a role of secondary importance. And when I say that, all the biometricians cringe, because everything that they do is based on stand density. And what we found out over a number of years with some other studies was that in thinnings based on different levels of stand density, that the dominant and codominant red oaks responded the same, whether we left 80 square feet of basal area or 50 square feet of basal area. So why be so tied to some certain level of stand density? Why not concentrate strictly on the quality of the stems that we have out there? So we came up with this little catchphrase, and in simplest terms, where stand quality management can be expressed as: if it's a good tree, we're going to leave it. If it's a poor tree, we're going to cut it. So to help us differentiate between what are good trees and what are poor trees, we developed a hardwood tree classification system based on tree quality and timber value. This system essentially replaces the Putnam system that Kyle Cunningham talked about earlier today. In using that system, we had some problems because we didn't think that Putnam had defined his tree classes very well. We left a lot of room for subjectivity, so we came up with a new tree class system. Our system consists of 5 tree classes that are used only for saw timber sized trees, and 2 tree classes that are used only for pole timber sized trees. And in descending order of quality and value, the saw timber size tree classes are preferred growing stock. I wish we had them all like that. Desirable growing stock, acceptable growing stock, cutting stock, and cull stock. And you've seen this picture earlier today that I wanted a royalty on. I didn't get it.
I'll buy you a beer.
Okay. Now, the preferred, the desirable, and the acceptable growing stock classes represent different degrees or different levels of tree quality, different levels of good trees. Whereas the cutting stock and the cull stock classes represent poor trees. And we have 2 pole timber classes, again in descending order of quality and in that case potential value. We have superior pole timber stock, which is the one with the clipboard at the bottom, which is a class of good trees, and inferior pole timber stock, which we're going to refer to as poor trees. So how do we use this? Well, we've taken our tree class system and its collection of good tree classes, which we are collectively calling growing stock, and our core tree classes, which we're collectively calling the overburden. I'm sure you've heard those terms before. And we're going to use those to define the residual component for 4 different thinning prescriptions. And as we go across, these check marks here indicate which trees are going to be left in the stand after each of these prescriptions. So we have acceptable growing stock with superior pole timber trees. We're going to leave these 3 tree classes along with our superior poles. Acceptable growing stock with no pole timber, same as this, but no superior pole timber left. Then desirable growing stock with superior pole timber. We're gonna go ahead and cut the acceptable tree class. Just leave these 2 along with the pole timber, and then in the most severe, a desirable growing stock with no pole timber, we're only going to leave the preferred and the desirable tree classes. So I want to run through an example of how we might implement this in a bottomland hardwood stand, and we've come up with a 5-step approach. So we're going to run through this example. This is a previously unmanaged 53-year-old stand along the Saline River in southeastern Arkansas, formerly Georgia Pacific land. Predominant oak species are water oak, willow oak. There's some cherry bark in there, and there's some cow oak or swamp chestnut oak. There's a lot of sweet gum in the overstory along with some scattered hickory, and the arrows indicate some of the good quality red oaks in the stand. So, step 1 of our 5-step process is to conduct a timber cruise to gather the necessary information about the stand. And this is the data that we need to collect on all of the sample trees. We need species, a DBH class, it can be 1 or 2 inch classes, the crown class, and the tree class. Then we're going to use these data, to calculate various stand level variables, trees per acre, basal area per acre, quadratic mean diameter, and a stocking percent. And then we're also going to prepare a tree class distribution of the stand. And this is the tree class distribution of our red oak stand in Arkansas. And we're presenting the data by tree class and summarizing it for the growing stock component. Again, this is our good trees, the overburden component, which is our poor trees, and then across the stand as a whole. One of the things I want to point out to you here is that the basal area of our growing stock component is 76 square feet per acre, which is about 60% of the total. Oaks in this stand accounted for about 39% of basal area, stand basal area, and we calculated the stocking to be 105%, which according to Jeff Geltz's stocking chart would be an overstock stand. Step 2 in our 5-step process is to use the information that we collected in our timber cruise to make the most appropriate management decision from among 3 different options. We can either regenerate the stand, we can thin the stand, or we can do nothing. And the manager regenerate kind of goes back to what Kyle was talking about this morning, or this afternoon, I guess, earlier today. Now, within step 2, there's actually 2 different decisions to make. Our first decision is, are we going to manage the stand or are we going to regenerate the stand? And this decision is based on the initial stand density and initial stand quality, which kind of goes back to what Kyle said earlier. You got to have enough trees out there to warrant continued management, and that's not enough. And you have to have enough quality out there to warrant continued management. So that's why it's based on density and quality. If our decision is that we are going to manage that stand, then our next decision is, do we thin the stand now or do we do nothing, allow it to grow until it's to the point where it's ready to be thinned? And that decision is based solely on density. Our decision rule for the manage or regenerate decision is that we are going to manage those stands in which stocking is at or above the C15 line. The C15 line would be a seriously understocked stand. So stocking has to be at least to the C15 line, and the growing stock component, our good trees, must account for at least 50% of total stand basal area. In other words, we've got to have enough trees and we got to have enough quality. If we don't meet either one of these two requirements, then our best option is to regenerate the stand. Now, our stand in Arkansas had a stocking of 105%, which is well above that C15 threshold, and our growing stock component in that stand was 60% of basal area, which is well above the 50% threshold, and so our decision in that stand is to manage the stand. Which brings us to our second decision in step 2. If we decide to manage that stand, do we want to go in and thin that stand now, or do we want to wait until the thinning is necessary? And this decision, as I said earlier, is based strictly on stand density. And our decision rule there is we are going to thin stands in which stocking is at, near, at, or above 100%. If it's not, then we're going to do nothing and wait until it gets there. And so our stand in Arkansas had a stocking of 105%, so our decision in this example stand is that we're going to thin the stand now. Step 3. If we're going to thin the stand now, then our next decision is we have to select the most appropriate stand quality management thinning prescription from that table that I had earlier that had the 4 different prescriptions. This decision is based on initial stand quality as represented by that tree class distribution prior to thinning, and the stage of stand development as measured by the length of time remaining in the rotation. And so we've come up with a conceptual model to help us select the appropriate thinning prescription to use. That model is based on our 2 factors, initial quality and the stage of stand development. And just, I'm not going to go through all of this, but if we have an early to mid rotation stand of medium initial quality, then we're going to select the acceptable superior treatment or prescription where we need to keep our acceptable growing stock trees to give us adequate stocking, and there's enough time left in the rotation to warrant keeping these superior pole timber trees and allow them to develop into good quality saw timber. If we're in a late fade, late rotation, then there's no need to keep those pole timber trees, and we would go ahead and cut them. And then if we have a high quality stand, we don't really need these acceptable saw timber trees. We have enough preferred and desirable to give us adequate stocking, and so we keep those. And then again, depending upon where you are in the rotation, whether you're going to keep your pole timber or not. So, and this is just a conceptual model. We have research in the ground to look at this and test this, but we need more results to confirm this, I think. So, let's go back to our stand in Arkansas and see how this might work. So the first thing we're going to do is use the tree class distribution to determine whether or not the stand has medium initial quality, in which case we would select one of those 2 acceptable prescriptions, or if it has high initial quality, in which case we would select one of the 2 desirable prescriptions. We've defined a medium quality stand as one in which the growing stock component accounts for at least 50% of stand basal area, but one in which the preferred and desirable tree classes account for less than 50% of stand basal area. If the preferred and desirable tree classes account for more than 50% of stand basal area, then we have a high quality stand. So in this stand, we've got 60%, this is now in percent now, 60% of the basal area is in growing stock, so we've met that qualification. We have 32% of the basal area is in the preferred and desirable, so that is less than that 50%, so we classify this stand as a medium quality stand. Okay, our second factor that we need to look at is the stage of stand development. How far are we from the end of the rotation? And if we are using an 80-year rotation in this stand, this 53-year-old stand has 27 years left until final harvest. Is that enough time for those superior pole timber trees to develop into quality saw timber if we leave them out there after thinning? Well, how do we figure that out? We used growth rates from previous studies similar to this, and based on that, we project that our superior pole timber trees, which are now about 10 inches in diameter, after 27 years after thinning, those trees will probably average about 17 inches in diameter. So we're going to make the conclusion that, yeah, there's enough time left in this rotation for those superior pole timber trees to develop into good quality saw timber, and so we're going to leave them out there, and we're going to call this a mid-rotation stand. So you put those two things together, and we decide we're going to select the acceptable superior thinning prescription for our early to mid-rotation stand of medium initial quality. So step 4 of this process is to physically mark the stand for thinning. And we're going to, based on the marking rules that are specific to that prescription. So we're going to mark the stand to remove only those tree classes specified in the selected prescription. So if we use the acceptable superior prescription, we're going to cut all the cutting stock, we're going to cut all the culls, remember this is for timber management, and we're going to cut the inferior pole timber, and we're going to leave everything else. At this point, there's no consideration whatsoever for residual stand density. It's already been blended into the process. And so all the timber marker has to do is go out there and focus solely on identifying trees in the tree classes that are specified for removal, and if that particular tree is in one of those tree classes, you're going to cut it. And it's important that we cut all trees in those specified tree classes. Okay? Now, here's a photo of a stand after we applied the acceptable superior thinning prescription. Unfortunately, this is not actually our stand in Arkansas, but this is a similar stand in Alabama where we've done this. I'm getting the 3-minute here. I thought at the end of the day I can talk as long as I want.
Yeah, but we're leaving.
No, I'll just keep on. Okay. So this is a similar stand in Alabama. The stand in Arkansas has not been cut. So we simulated an acceptable superior thinning prescription in our stand in Arkansas. And this is probably about what it would look like. We had, after we did the simulated thinning on our stand in Arkansas, we had 76 square feet of basal area left. Our quadratic mean diameter was 16.1 inches, and we knocked stocking down to 62%. But we did increase the proportion of preferred and desirable trees from 32% of stand basal area before thinning to 54% after thinning, and we increased the oak component from 39% before thinning to 51% after thinning. This is as a percentage of basal area. And that's about what it would look like. So our final step is to plan subsequent thinnings based on what we expect to happen in that stand. And our decision rule there is to conduct subsequent thinnings when stocking again reaches near, at, or above 100%. And when we get to that point, we're going to go back in and do another timber cruise, just like we did in step 1, and repeat the process again. And we're going to do this for each thinning until we get to the final harvest of the stand. Okay. So, using data from similar studies, similar stands, similar trees, we simulated the response of our stand in Arkansas to this acceptable superior thinning prescription in terms of mortality, diameter growth, and changes in tree class. Just because it has a desirable tree class today doesn't mean it's going to have that in 10 years. And we essentially grew our stand for 18 years until at age 71, our stocking again approached 100%. And at age 71, this is what it would look like. We've got 124 square feet of basal area, quadratic mean diameter is now 22 inches, and stocking of the stand is 97%. The oaks accounted for about 53% of stand basal area. So let's quickly run through our process again to see what we're going to do with this stand at age 71. With stocking at 97% and our growing stock component here, our good trees at 84% of basal area, we're obviously going to continue to manage this stand to the end of the rotation. And with stocking near 100%, our decision is we're going to thin this stand now. But which is the best thinning prescription to use? Okay, if you remember by definition, a high quality stand was one in which the preferred and the desirable accounted for over 50% of stand basal area, and we've got 51%. So we're going to call this a high quality stand now. And at age 71 in an 80-year rotation, we're clearly in a late rotation stand. So if we put those two facts together, a late rotation stand, high quality, this is the thinning prescription that we're going to use at this point. We're going to do a desirable, no pole prescription where all we're going to leave is the preferred and the desirable trees, and we're going to cut everything else. And hopefully this is what it might look like after the second thinning. Again, this is not our stand in Arkansas, but this is actually a stand on Knoxville Refuge in Mississippi after this desirable no pole prescription. But again, we simulated the response of the stand in Arkansas to this thinning, and at this point, after this second thinning at age 71, we would have about 63 square feet of basal area per acre. Quadratic mean diameter would be almost 25 inches, and we, in this case, knocked stocking down to 49%. Oaks now account for 71% of basal area. And so if you look at this slide, and you notice how open this is and the high amount of sunlight that we're receiving on the ground, we have a very high oak component in the overstory. We believe, we don't have data to back this up, but we believe that we're going to get oak regeneration in here, and it's going to have enough sunlight to develop, and then we're going to come back in 9 years from now, 10 years, and remove the remaining overstory, which would then release that advanced regeneration, and hopefully we would not have to do a lot of the remedial treatments that Andy was talking about. It'd save us some money. We don't know if it's going to work or not because we don't have the data for it, but that's the idea anyway. And with that, I'll leave it.